Good afternoon. Happy Halloween. I'm David Rosenberg, director of the Robert Zicklin Center for Corporate Integrity and a professor in the law department here at Baruch College. Thanks for coming to an extremely timely talk by Professor Larry Cunningham entitled How Boards Can Steer CEOs and Companies in Choppy Waters. Before I introduce Larry, please welcome Dean of the Zicklin School of Business, Bruce Weber, who will share a few words.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for coming to the very special talk we have today. And as the Dean of the Zicklin School, it's really a pleasure to be able to build bridges between different parts of the business and educational community. And I think this is a great example today. Our speaker, Larry Cunningham, and I have known each other for just over 12 years. And we just realized that exactly 10 years ago, just about to the day, I was doing the same thing at the University of Delaware, where I was the dean, inviting Larry Cunningham up to the microphone to give a talk on a recent book that you'd written about Berkshire Hathaway and the leadership of Warren Buffett. And it was a terrific lecture that day. It's going to be a terrific lecture today. What I'm most thrilled about with Larry coming and visiting us here at the Zicklin School is his ability to intersect law, investments, and management. And when you think about, what drives the New York City economy, those three are all very, very important here. And what Larry pointed out, I recall in his talk from 10 years ago, was he was one of the few people that really looked at Berkshire Hathaway as a management innovation organization. Most people look at it in terms of the returns. How are the investors doing? What's Warren Buffett's magic? Looking at the portfolio companies. But what Larry did is he drilled down deep on what happens when Berkshire Hathaway invests in the firm. How does the management and leadership and the vision change? And by documenting that, giving business students and law students, I presume as well, access to those insights is a tremendous source of value to us. So 10 years on, we're going to hear about another important topic, which is, what do leaders say? What do leaders do when they get in front of a microphone in this very fractious age that we're in, with polarized audiences everywhere? And it's going to be very meaningful, I think, for us in higher education, because if you've read a lot of news about universities recently, the most popular step to take right now is to declare that in the role of president or dean or provost, we're going to stand for institutional neutrality, right? Which sounds great on paper, but what does it mean to be institutionally neutral? It's a muddy concept. I think people are going to be working hard to ensure that universities continue to be an open forum for ideas and debate, not a place of censoring. But getting there is challenging also for CEOs, and we're going to hear about it from Larry Cunningham today. So I'll give the microphone back, David. Thanks for allowing me to introduce a longtime friend and colleague, graduate of the University of Delaware, also graduate of a very special school in Philadelphia called Girard College. So Larry's Girard College background, I think, is a big part of his personality, his ethos, if you will. So thanks for coming, Larry. Really looking forward to hearing from you. With that, back to you, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for connecting us with Larry, and thanks also to the Baruch Accounting Society for helping us organize this event. During this time of extreme political polarization, I think Bruce used that word as well, corporations seem to be playing a central but unfamiliar role. Consumers, employees, activists, shareholders, politicians, and of course celebrities are calling for businesses to take stands on controversial issues such as the environment, gay and transgender rights, abortion, guns, immigration, and even democracy itself. And yet when corporations do take such stands, they're condemned for corrupting the political process and for alienating many of their core stakeholders. This leads to further polarization, that word again, and encourages corporate leaders to abandon any attempt at social responsibility whatever that means, and to return to the not-so-distant days when a singular focus of the board was simply the bottom line, without regard to the effect that the company had on stakeholders and what stands a corporation might take on political and social issues. I'm delighted that Professor Larry Cunningham will speak on this subject at the Zicklin Center today, because he has confronted these issues as a scholar, check it out, a scholar, a lawyer, a board member, a corporate advisor, and of course, as a citizen. So he brings many different experiences to this subject. He recognizes that in the real world, business leaders can't rely on abstract theories and generalizations in order to navigate the very complex dilemmas presented by the ever-changing social and political controversies that swirl around American society. As a thinker and practitioner, he's an ideal speaker to address these thorny questions to our audience at the Zicklin Center for Corporate Integrity. Larry has held numerous prestigious positions in academia and the legal world, and is currently director, as Dean Weber said, of the Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware, one of the country's most respected academic institutes, addressing how businesses are run in, of course, the state which is the center of corporate governance in the United States. Before Larry begins, please note that we'll have time for questions. We have 2 microphones on either side. If you'd like to ask a question, please wait patiently behind the microphone and ask a brief and focused question. I'm happy to welcome Professor Larry Cunningham to the Zicklin Center for Corporate Integrity. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all very much, David, for those extremely kind remarks, and Bruce for your equally extremely kind remarks. Bruce mentioned that it was about 10 years ago to this day when I spoke at the University of Delaware before I joined that faculty, and Bruce was the dean. It was the Chap Tyler Lecture. And my wife, who is with me today, was with me then, Stephanie Cuba. Afterwards, she and the dean were talking, and they decided that I ought to join his advisory board. So for the past 10 years before he came to Baruch, I was on that advisory board, and I want to thank both of them for making that happen. So it's the second time I've spoken at a place where Bruce Weber is dean. It's also the second time I'm speaking here at CUNY. 10 years before that, when I just launched the collection of Warren Buffett's letters, the essays of Warren Buffett, I gave a talk here at CUNY. So it's neat I feel a little bit at home here, which is nice when addressing such a controversial topic as we're going to discuss. CEOs speaking out. Oops. Let's see. There we go. Could you guys put that back on the full screen there? Thanks, Rocky. I also want to thank Rocky. You guys are lucky at the Zicklin Center for having such a director. He makes everything work and work easily. So thank you very much for everything you've done, including just there. So if I push this, we'll go right to there we go. You may have seen these stories in the paper yesterday and the magazine the other day, where, as Bruce and David just signaled, CEOs are pressured from all sides to speak out or to not speak out. And most dramatically, it's on this question of should the CEOs of our companies, of our leading companies, be endorsing one of the other candidates or maybe a third candidate, or is it better for them to stay silent? And now the fact is, despite the media attention to whether CEOs are endorsing candidates for the presidency or down ballot, very few of them are. Most of them are, for good reasons that I'll explain, not endorsing or opposing candidates for political office. But they are speaking out on lots of other topics, including that list that David gave. And that raises some very subtle issues to which the dean and the professor both adverted. These are subtle issues, yet even, and I'll explore the subtleties and try to wade into them together. But despite the subtleties, we still have very determined polar positions. Characteristic of our contemporary discourse, you have a credible popular position on one side saying CEOs are duty-bound to take positions on these important topics. And you have an equally opposed popular, incredible position that says they're duty-bound not to speak out. And so this creates a dilemma for CEOs as well as for their boards of directors. And as I weigh in on this controversy, I feel a little bit like how those CEOs feel, because after all, I'm doing the very thing they struggle with. I'm speaking out on the controversial topic of speaking out on controversial topics. Or, as my wife is needling me about this talk, she said, I'm speaking out on speaking out. So it is a little like that. And I do not align myself with either of these extreme positions of being duty-bound to speak or duty-bound to silence, but instead recommend that CEOs and their boards of directors evaluate each topic and each situation individually in context, evaluating the pros and cons of taking a position in the unique circumstances, rather than adhering to a rigid rule one way or the other. And I develop a principled framework in this talk that would allow each board and each CEO to make a context-specific judgment on what is best, speaking out on a particular topic or remaining silent. There's been a lot of data generated on this topic in the past decade, and it's new. It's only been around for a decade. CEOs were not typically asked, pressured, or willing to speak out on hot-button issues until just the last few years. So I'm run through a dozen data points on this topic from this polling data that reveals the diverse and sometimes dissenting views. First, a majority of Americans believe that CEOs have a role influencing lawmakers on topics ranging from corporate tax policy to voting rights, although significant minorities do not think so. And that role doesn't necessarily mean speaking out, as Americans are evenly divided over whether CEOs should do that. And political differences appear, with Democrats likelier to support speaking out and Republicans likelier to support staying silent. Risk cuts both ways, though it veers slightly higher for speaking out than staying silent, with 89% associating speaking out with some risk and 61% associating staying silent with some risk. Almost no one says speaking out is risk-free, while 22% think silence is. These divisions explain why public relations executives at American companies spend increasing parts of their day talking about whether our CEO should speak out on a particular topic or not, as well as why general counsels, the lawyers for our companies, are about evenly split on this as well. 52% support a company policy of the CEO not speaking out, while 48% oppose such a policy. And those general counsels aren't even sure whether the CEO speaking out would be good for the company or bad for the company. And those that do have an opinion are evenly split. Amid all that division and uncertainty, CEOs appear equally mixed, 48% staying silent, and 45% speaking out on at least some issue. The stakes can be vexing, illustrated by the saga of the Walt Disney Company about a year or so ago over Florida's controversial elementary sex education curriculum. At first, the CEO chose silence, not to speak out, which alienated some workers and some activists, and so he decided, with board support, to speak out, alienating a different set of workers and some lawmakers. The fallout from that saga included a lawsuit against the board for endorsing that speaking out, which incidentally the board won for reasons I'll explain. But worse, a settlement with the state of Florida earlier this year in which Disney relinquished its control over significantly highly valuable historical real estate. So a huge price they paid. Why this new phenomenon? What forces have led to this novel pressure on CEOs to grapple with this? Many different factors have conspired to produce this pressure, they start with structural changes in the corporate landscape, starting with shareholder demographics. Index funds now dominate stock ownership in America, and they are more interested in systemic, overall performance and social issues than company-specific issues. The Business Roundtable several years ago updated its statement of corporate purpose to announce that the purpose of the corporation includes advancing the interests not just of stockholders, but of all stakeholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, and communities. Those stakeholders have responded to that change with demands for action. On trust, there has been a decline in trust in government, complicated by the snafus around the governmental response to the COVID crisis, and there has been a concomitant increase in the trust of corporations, including CEOs. Civic change has driven calls for CEOs to speak out, led by the momentum behind movements like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, growing climate change awareness, and our era's emphasis on personal values among consumers, workers, and investors. And to all of that, add social media and its power to generate coordinated action, and perhaps it's no surprise that you see these pressures. But it's not unidirectional. There are counterforces also in play. These include the longstanding duties of corporate leaders. CEOs and their boards owe fiduciary duties under state law to the corporation and its stockholders. And they must put those interests ahead of their own interests or their own values or preferences. In addition, despite the rising power of stakeholders like customers and workers, it's the shareholders who elect the corporate directors, not those groups. It's the shareholders who can sue those people for violation of duties, not those non-shareholders. And directors don't owe those stakeholders any special duties. And above all, I think, the debates on important topics like what's the purpose of the corporation, for whom are or should directors be fiduciaries, or have been reignited. Debates about corporate purpose and other constituencies are a counterforce because we've been discussing those challenges for at least 80 years, and I'll review those momentarily. So that history suggests, despite some feeling that we're in a brand new world, that we're in unprecedented times, we've never seen anything like this before, we've actually been here many, many times. So it's not even clear from the data whether leaders consider CEOs speaking out on hot topics a matter of board prerogative. Although I think there's a trend to thinking that boards do have a role to play in this, especially among general counsels who increasingly say this is a board issue, and for good reasons. And it's not just because of the hot-button topics. Corporations face hot-button topics all the time in the ordinary course of business, such as employee benefits, whether to cover domestic partners or to pay for abortion travel expenses, or customer marketing, including how to brand things or what spokespersons to choose to promote products. Those are all managerial prerogatives, not board issues. Rather, CEOs speaking out can become a board issue because, first, its purpose is to draw attention and take a position on a particular public policy debate, and that directly creates or mitigates risk for that company. Second, the CEO's personal persona is injected into this atmosphere on behalf of the company, but not in the ordinary course of business. And third, selecting and overseeing the CEO is the board's most important job. Now, despite all of that, board approaches to this topic also vary and are evolving. research from a recent board survey indicates that 37% of respondents say the board has discussed this topic, the question of CEOs speaking out, and another 8% were about to. Boards are gradually proposing related oversight in various committees, although a significant minority say the CEO is permitted to speak out without board approval. And boards vary in their approach to documenting such oversight, with 31% having a firm-specific framework, but another 30% having no documentation at all. These findings highlight the different approaches that boards have been taking in the evolving approach, which I think suggests that there's no one-size-fits-all to this challenge of board oversight of CEOs speaking out. Now, turning inside the boardroom, how directors think about this challenge, these complexities, they will appreciate that boards of directors of companies are both a legal construct with rules and boundaries and purposes, as well as a social organism driven by personalities and dynamics and relationships. And so you've got a set of legal duties and you've got practical realities to contend with. As a matter of law, directors must remember that their fundamental commitment is to the corporation and its stockholders. That commitment, to repeat, must supersede personal values or the interests of other stakeholders. The legal framework emphasizes that directors must determine what is good for a company, what is desirable for a company, what is beneficial for a company and its shareholders. And the standard of review that judges apply when evaluating director discharge of this duty is open-textured. It's about reasonableness, good faith, diligence, not rigid rules or even best practices, what other people are doing. And I should add, the legal risk to directors is slight. Directors are rarely held personally liable for breaches of any duty, especially duties in this realm, as that Disney case that the directors won last year indicates. But that doesn't mean that they're risk-free. Apart from legal risk, there's risk to reputation. It takes time to sit in the spotlight. The Disney directors spent enormous amounts of time litigating that case, and it certainly impairs their re-electability at other companies. On the social side, as a practical matter, boards should attempt to align CEO public positions with corporate objectives. Doing that involves a balance between the CEO's leadership and influence at the company and the board's oversight capacity and responsibilities. The board's role is not to adhere to a specific ideology, but to ensure that any CEO or company position is in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. The dynamics of the boardroom vary widely based on personalities, governance structures, the industry a company is in, and the relationship between the CEO and the directors, as well as the company's history of public engagement. It's widely appreciated that the best boards, the most effective governance structures, tend to deploy a collaborative and cooperative relationship between the board and the CEO, not a combative, disputatious one. And ideally, the board should empower the CEO to be the voice of the company, and the CEO in turn should appreciate and value the board's counsel in this process. So on the topic of the CEO speaking out, the proper role of the board of directors is to help the CEO develop a framework to provide guardrails to navigate the position-taking decision. And such a framework should be accompanied by periodic dialogue and recurring updates. So an example of such a framework would put the easiest cases at the extremes and the more contextual and substantive ones in between. In this framework, the CEO would have total discretion concerning matters like wages, prices, earnings, and community involvement to speak out on those topics without needing any consultation with the board. And on the other hand, at the other extreme, ruling out and prohibiting the CEO from endorsing particular candidates or platforms or parties. Then the hot topics in between that pose contextual challenges can be evaluated in terms of their nexus or their connection to the company's business, whether they're within the company's line of business or outside of it. I list a few examples there. Take the one on the bottom of book bans for publishers. There's been a raging debate nationwide where parents will sometimes seek to prohibit the use or the presence of certain books in classrooms or libraries. Well, that's obviously, and school districts, teachers, some students push back and want any book there. So you've seen this debate straight across the country, including right here in New York City. Well, that's obviously a business decision for book publishers like Random House, and indeed the Random House Board of Directors authorized its CEO to speak out publicly against any sort of book bans. For most companies, however, that topic would not be within the corporation's business, and that would be true also for most other of our hot button issues, from gun control to transgender debates. On the thorniest issues where there is a company interest, but it's still risky or dangerous to speak out, a common and recommended route is to consider working with trade groups and other professional associations with the relevant resources and expertise to help formulate a public policy position as a group. And that strategy includes both joining organizations and withdrawing from them publicly when a company disagrees. For example, Unilever publicly withdrew from the Chamber of Commerce in 2017 over disagreements about the public policy positions the Chamber was taking. Or earlier this year, a number of large financial institutions withdrew from the Climate Action 100 organization when they decided that the public policy positions were not consistent with their obligations to their constituencies. So a framework like this should not be rigid. It should make it clear that the CEO need not come to the board for permission to discuss any given topic, but having the lanes marked out clearly is a way to set expectations and to guide the CEO to determine on what topics consultation would be needed. Very importantly, the board must respect the CEO's autonomy and managerial prerogatives. There's an old saying in corporate governance from the National Association of Corporate Directors that says the board's proper disposition is to be nose in and fingers out. So lots of sniffing, lots of probing, lots of good productive questions, but not second guessing, not overreaching, not making managerial decisions. And so the framework is designed to be consistent with that approach. And another advantage and purpose of the framework is to bring the board and the CEO together to promote that collaborative, collegial working relationship rather than ignite an antagonistic or disputatious one. That's critical because a CEO that's out in front of the board is likely to face termination. And a board of directors who is not in line with the CEO will face reputational risks and adverse responses from many constituents, including shareholders, when it comes time for election. So the most promising route to alignment and cohesion in the boardroom is for the group and the CEO to agree that the number one priority is the company's business. Each board and CEO has to make their own judgments about how to apply this framework or even delineate it for their particular business. There is no one-size-fits-all. This blueprint, this arrangement, this framework has to be articulated based on specific facts in that company, in a given company. And so board of directors thinking about a framework like this will have to rely upon management to provide the information and data to help think about what is our company's business, where are the boundaries. Now, that said, I can highlight some empirical data points from the extensive literature that's burgeoning in this area to highlight some trade-offs that are generally applicable, that are somewhat universal. The first couple there are about the issue's relevance to a company, and I highlight two factors that stand out. The first, quite intuitively, is that the greatest risks are with commenting on highly polarized issues, where the public is close to evenly split on a topic. The closer an issue is to 50-50 polarity, the greater the risk the company in speaking out on that subject. Second, there's a far lower risk of backlash and other problems when a CEO speaks on topics that have a close nexus to the business's operations, most specifically employee benefits. And that would include travel expenses for abortion costs, domestic partner coverage, and so on. When thinking about the CEO's personal role in this, two factors can mitigate any risk, the empirical evidence shows. And the first, the CEO's comments should be genuine and true. This is not the place for a marketing gimmick or some sort of strategic ploy. Authenticity resonates with people, even people who disagree with you. And so that's critically important. There's also new recent empirical literature suggesting that CEOs that are widely identified as partisan individuals by large donations to political organizations and so on tend to create greater risks for their companies, whatever they say or do. Just worth keeping in mind for boards of directors. And second, comments, the evidence shows that comments that are consistent with the company's established practices and prior disclosures also carry less risk, even if they might otherwise be controversial. And finally, an understanding of the corporation's constituents is critical. First, consumers often prefer to spend on products that align with their personal values. So it's important to understand these values and assess whether the CEO's speaking out will align with those values or contradict them. Second, employees generally appreciate it when their CEOs make statements that reflect their own views and bristle otherwise. So in a company that has a diverse workforce, caution is indicated in CEO's speech. And third, and most vexing, the relationship between a company's CEO speaking out or staying silent on the one hand, and shareholder returns or economic performance is mixed at best. It's an intractable area of research, and so the caution there is that any company evaluating whether to take a public position through their CEO must think carefully about their investor composition, their shareholder base, and the potential reactions, which are very hard to predict. I think this framework, and I've discussed this framework, was advised several boards in developing it and tailoring it, and it seems to be very helpful as a practical matter. It helps position boards and CEOs to be ahead of the curve and not strictly reactive when agitation comes their way. It helps to calm the discussions when pressures mount. And so it has, I think, great practical appeal. And I'm on 3 public company boards. Fortunately, so far, at least, we haven't had to face this, but I've surfaced it in informal ways, and it has appeal as a practical matter. So I like it. And I want to add one point about the appeal. David said that it's not useful for commentators to provide abstract thought upon the topic, and I'm delighted that he said that, because I agree, and I think this framework has enormous practical value. It also, I think, has great value in helping boards think about the fuel behind this debate, which is that big, long-standing debate over corporate purpose and corporate constituents. This vexing question about for whom are directors fiduciaries? Is it the shareholder alone and profit maximization, as David suggested, or is it multiple constituents? And how do you deal with that? And I think the framework would help a director think through these debates. And what I'd like to do here is just recognize call your attention to the fact that these debates are more than a century old. And despite the debates occurring in varying socioeconomic settings with unique political, economic, and social dynamics, the underlying and recurring issues are identical. So way back in the 1930s, a famous debate occurred between Professors Adolph Burley and Merrick Dodd on that fundamental question, with Dodd saying corporations are economic institutions, and Burley countering that they are social institutions. Dodd thought thought that directors should be beholden solely to shareholders. Burley thought they should also be accountable to broader social objectives. A raging hot debate, and it settled down when the mainstream partook of streams of both of these positions, so that corporations are both economic and social institutions. For decades, the mission of the corporation was to generate economic profit for shareholders, but simultaneously recognizing and contributing to the public weal and social welfare. Then in the 1960s and 70s, the debate flared again during a period when economists such as Milton Friedman advocated very aggressively that the purpose of a corporation was to make money for stockholders, and that's it. Or I guess he would say that their social function is to deliver the goods and services that people want and employ people. But the primary function of doing all of that is to deliver returns to shareholders. On the other hand, critics, led by Ralph Nader, advocated a broader social conception for the corporation and wrote a famous book about taming the giant corporation and trying to induce it to become aware, become more focused on a avowed stakeholder conception. And the Naderites won many important legislative milestones, including legislation that began to protect consumers and to protect the environment. But their assaults on corporate America became too extreme for the mainstream to sustain, and a period focused more on stockholder value returned during the 80s. But during that decade, the takeover battles that raged between raiders and corporate boards laid bare the tension between shareholder interests and the interests of other constituencies, especially employees and communities. Now, in that era, directors lobbied to promote the interests of other constituents. It would make it easier for them to discharge their function, I think. And the law finally settled the fight by saying directors are still beholden primarily to the stockholders, but they can take account of the interests of non-shareholder constituents as long as that action was rationally related to the shareholders' interest. So a blending, right? Just like when Burley and Dodd, their debate sort of settled in the middle, this debate settled in the middle too. But then again, in the 1980s, critics began to assail even that form of shareholder primacy as irresponsible. And they advocated diverting corporate assets from shareholders to others, and they too overshot their mark, and so that movement, the corporate social responsibility, did not gain traction. But also during that decade, researchers began to find correlations between the economic performance of companies and certain metrics of social responsibility, such as pollution control, employee fairness, and product quality, and the like. These dynamics, this research, set the stage for the United Nations to issue its principles of ESG, standing for environmental, social, and governance protocols. The United Nations issued these principles in 2005 at the New York Stock Exchange, the citadel of shareholder primacy. But unlike the predecessors from the corporate social responsibility movement, the Nader movement, and even what Burley was talking about, unlike all that, this movement emphasized that adherence to the ESG principles was perfectly aligned with shareholder interests. It would drive long-term shareholder value. This was an ingenious conception and helps to explain why ESG went mainstream and had a significant influence on corporate behavior over the next decade and more. A boom period for that movement. Now, in the past few years, that movement has faced a backlash for a variety of reasons, including the following. It's hard to define exactly what those principles are intended to achieve. The United Nations didn't do it completely. So there's a definitional question about, well, what are the boundaries and aims of an environmental principle? What are the boundaries and aims of a social principle? Second, technical ones like how to measure any of those aims or outcomes, how to report, how to audit and verify ESG performance. Ethical ones, such as how to balance the interests of different constituents. There are no well-regarded mechanisms to balance the trade-offs that are inherent in this complex system. And political ones, which are how to respond to the pressures that various groups will apply in moving ESG priorities. Now, amid all of this, and I have that comment there about a bust. There's no question the ESG backlash has been alive and well. There is now talk in some circles that the ESG movement is a bust. There's an amazing Financial Times podcast probing that topic just within the last month or so. It's a very interesting moment we're in. It's in flux. I don't know if it's an inflection point, but we're certainly the pendulum is swinging. And amid all of that, boards yearn for clarity and certainty on how should we be thinking about all these topics, then especially on CEOs speaking out. And here I return to the polarity with which I began of the two popular credible positions, one side saying CEOs should be speaking out on these topics, and that side tends to prefer the stakeholder conception. It's Burley, Nader, CSR, ESG, and the other side says it's the economic stockholder model. It aligns with Dodd or Milton Friedman, the shareholder wealth maximization group. Yet, as my historical sketch suggests, neither of these polar positions have ever prevailed. The reality of corporate America has always been somewhere in between. And I don't think our world is any different now, despite the counter pressures and pressures. There are staunch extremists, I think, who think corporations should only maximize shareholder value. And there are others who think they're absolutely only social institutions and markets and private enterprise are a failure. But I think the history suggests these extreme positions are unlikely to be sustained. And so appreciating the compromise that emerged from the Burley-Dodd debate, that corporations are both economic and social institutions, and that particular decisions about what to prioritize have to appreciate that balance. And in my view, practical matter, Professor Rosenberg, boards would be better appreciating that and working within it rather than joining the debates on one side or the other. And I think my framework helps them do that. And I would, as David said, welcome your questions. But before I do, I want to thank again Dean Weber and Professor Rosenberg and Rocky, and all of you for coming here today. I welcome your questions and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this fabulous presentation and historical overview. I have two questions. First one is related to this historical sketch. And I submit that today, we live in the information or disinformation society. And that has significant consequences on the business and the perception. So, my first question to you, and my question is inspired by yesterday Meta quarterly reports when Zuckerberg presented a week before election the emphasis on innovation, which is very different from 2020, where he was talking about the commitment of the organization to facts and truths. So my first question is, does the word democracy belong to corporate vocabulary in the space such as social media, which is a very powerful space? And my second question is a pragmatic one. So we are a week to a momentum event. The outcomes are predicted based on different parameters. Should the boards at this point have scenario planning for certain scenarios, such as elephant in the room here, perhaps social unrest?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see you again. So, yeah, two questions: democracy's role in corporate life, and then contingency planning for violence and riots next Tuesday or after Inauguration Day. And yeah, I think the answers are yes and yes. I think corporations are recognized under our constitutional law as legal as juridical entities. They have certain constitutional rights. They have a First Amendment right to free speech. They have a Fifth Amendment right to against self-incrimination. Certain rights wouldn't apply, like the Eighth Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. There's an old saying in corporate law that there is no soul to be damned or body to kick. So a corporation is a person in legal terms for certain things, and that would include the right to speak. It's no question if Zuckerberg or any other CEO on behalf or a board would like to authorize a corporation to speak, they have the same First Amendment rights as anybody else. And and for the boardroom, I haven't really heard a director ever kind of make that argument in discussing, well, should we have a view on the Georgia voting rule, or should we have a view on the immigration or the travel ban for this religious group? But I haven't heard anybody say, hey, we have a First Amendment right to do that. I think that's incontestable and indisputable. The question then is the rationality of exercising it, the prudence of wading in, and those are challenging points. But corporations have a right to participate in democracy for sure. They don't have the right to vote, but they have the right to do that. And so my challenge is less one about their rights or role in democracy than how a board and a CEO might go about exercising them in the discourse around hot topics. In terms of contingency planning, yes, I think in this polarized environment, I think there's a media consensus that one can expect disappointed advocates on either side, whoever wins, to produce backlash, which might include rioting and violence. So I think being prepared for that is important. I know the universities I'm involved with are very much prepared for that, and I think. Unfortunately, it is a reality. The one last point to make, though, in your observation that we live in the information and disinformation age, and that amplifies the stakes and so on. I think there's certainly something unique about our environment, but I also think that a lot of things we think are unprecedented really aren't. I mean, there have always been lies and truths and exaggerations and speaking, way back when with pamphleteers, how do you say that? Pamphleteers, right? Thomas Paine and those guys, the town crier. So yeah, everything's a little different and high tech, but I mean, we've always had hot debates, duels. So I think I wish things were a little calmer, but I don't think it's sui generis. I think we have had these battles and probably will.
Thank you. Can you discuss annual shareholder meetings, which when they were in person, were a vehicle for shareholders to challenge corporations, CEOs, and boards, but now that they're largely virtual, have strict limitations on questions and time? And will the SEC ever mandate a return to in-person meetings or institute rules to reform the virtual meetings to ensure greater shareholder questions?
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. My wife Stephanie and I wrote an article in the Journal of the Museum of American Finance called Financial History, which was a history of the shareholder meeting as a vehicle for exercising the rights of stockholders, and with Evelyn Moss and was it the Coen brothers? What was the name of those brothers? It's not the Coen brothers. They're the filmmakers. I'm getting older here. I can't. But those guys. So there were gadflies. I used to call them gadflies, but they would be there pushing the CEO to be more accountable, to have better disclosure, more communications, more accurate auditing for our accounting friends in the audience. And they were those meetings were very important to promoting managerial accountability, for advancing the stockholder rights movement. I mean, I skipped over that. The big thing that happened in the 50s between Burl and Dodd and Friedman and Nader, we had the shareholder movement for 30 years. It was an anti-managerialist program, and it was enormously successful. And the annual meeting was the principal vehicle for doing that. And so we celebrate, Stephanie and I in that article, we celebrated that. And some CEOs leaned in and made it a wonderful opportunity to engage. So Berkshire Hathaway is famous for that, but so is Harley Davidson and Walmart and Tootsie Roll. But you're absolutely right that Delaware authorized annual meetings to be held remotely in 2002. And ComputerShare, which is a big host for electronic meetings, campaigned, marketed that. And so a lot of companies had been doing it by 2019, but obviously beginning then, every company did. And you're absolutely right, it made it a lot harder for gadflies or advocates to stand up, to have to stand at the microphone. And so it shifted that dynamic enormously. And so for those CEOs, those leaders who would like to hide and they don't want to talk to shareholders, the remote meeting is terrific. And the shareholders do pay the price. And that's it's a great topic. It's a very important topic. Just to be more on whether the Securities and Exchange Commission is the federal agency that is responsible for overseeing corporate disclosure and stock market trading and the investment advisory industry. Their jurisdiction doesn't really go to how companies manage their internal affairs and their relations with stockholders and their meetings and stuff like that. So it would be hard for me to imagine the SEC being able lawfully to pass a rule that says you have to have an in-person annual meeting. That would have to happen at the state level. And I'm from Delaware. I work in Delaware. I think a lot about Delaware. I don't expect Delaware to require that anytime soon. It prefers a menu approach, which permits companies to tailor their governance arrangements how they wish. So I don't see them doing that. Where that pressure might come from are the activist shareholders, who do have corporate America's ear, and they can apply a lot of different pressure points to entice corporate governance reforms. And you see some of that. You see it on a one-by-one, where Duke Energy, for example, I think they went remote and their constituents rebelled. we want to talk to you face to face, in Atlanta. It's a great question. I'm happy to talk to you about it more. We're writing another article about exactly that, right? Back to the other side.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for the enriching presentation. My question is regarding nexus issues or intercompany issues. Do you think that the CEO should approximate themselves to policies which are predicated on recent political events, or should they try to distance themselves? At a previous company that I worked for example, after the Roe v. Wade overturning, they added extra funding for people to fly out for women's healthcare choices, for example. But they did not say the CEO. Instead, they released a memo from the company just said the company is providing this. Even though I know, because I work with the CEO, that it was directly from the CEO. Do you think that CEO should be distancing themselves from the issues or approximating themselves to them?
Yeah, that's the money question. That's the $1 million question. My broad answer is that it will depend on the company, depend on that CEO, depend on the workforce, depend on where they're located, where most of the workforce is located, what they make. And so ultimately, it's a good board decision to evaluate. And as I said, they think through things like, well, if the CEO speaks out on that, that's a hot button issue, especially in certain places. That may not be good for the employees or for the customers or for them, the leadership or for the stock. So why would we do that? Is it to vent, to weigh in, to use that pulpit to what advantage? To achieve some social objective? But that's a private interest. They have to think, is this good for the customers? Is this good for the employees? Is it good for the community? And in the framework you gave, I mean, if I was on that board, I don't know enough of the details, but I'd say, look, I think that sounds right. There's not a particular advantage to this company of the CEO going on national television saying, I'm going to fund through our employment benefits package this procedure, because we think that's the right thing to do. What is the advantage to the company? There's a clear advantage of saying, this is a policy we have. We believe in this right. We believe in protecting it. We will support you. And what does that do for the company? It attracts and retains personnel. It signals a benefit package that is very appealing to people. So that's how I would think. To me, that's a very prudent approach. That we're protecting our company and its workers, not trying to influence public debates on very controversial issues, right? Whatever our heartfelt, we have very strong feelings on that in our family, but it's really not my place as a director to tell my company, these are my strong feelings, this is what we have to do. My personal feelings are irrelevant in that boardroom. And I think the CEO did the right thing. So. But thank you. That's the money, that's the $1 million question. And other side?
I believe he was first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, my question kind of relates to that as well. So how could board members or boards, without seeming hypocritical, address certain issues and not speak about others?
No, I think they have to leave their personal priorities at the door. And if they have a conflict, an irreconcilable conflict between their personal values and their fiduciary obligations, they need to resign. They can't hold that. They can't hold that job. It's hard to do that. It's hard to say, oh well, at home I have this religious view, but here in the boardroom I have to be agnostic. And it's hard to do that, but it's possible. And if you can't do it, then you can't have that job. That's my opinion, and I think that's where I come to after the analysis that I do. Does that help?
Yeah, so not even as individuals, but like as the company as the board members representing the companies, how can they choose, using the framework, which topics they want to speak on and maybe not speak on another topic at a later point?
Yeah. Well, yeah, under my framework, and each board needs to articulate their own, but my framework requires or probes a link between the company's business interests and that policy issue. So Random House and book banning. And there might be some really awful books that would be banned, and that might be good for society. But Random House is in the business of protecting its authors and protecting its readers, whoever they are. And so that seems a natural thing for them to want to weigh in on. But then and that doesn't mean they then have to weigh in on abortion or transgender rights or anything else. They think each time, how is this related to our company and our job as stewards of that company? right? And so abortion, travel expense reimbursement, okay, that is important for our employees, and it's a good benefits policy that management has developed. And beyond that, there's no nexus, there's no constraint upon us to weigh in on that topic. That'd be how I think about it. And the framework is designed, to be principled, principles-based and contextual. So it can be tailored to all different kinds of settings. So I don't want to be too prescriptive about what a company should do or how a given company should decide, well, weighing in on these but not weighing in on those. So I'll leave it open textured, but that would be my approach to it. Yes, sir.
Yes, hello, Mr. Cunningham. Pleasure to meet you, and the presentation was great. Please just allow me a few moments to frame the question that I'll ask. So, I notice there's a lot of discussion about shareholders and boards of directors and then managers of companies, so the CEOs. And it is my observation that, when the public makes demands of boards and CEOs to take positions on certain social issues, environmental governance issues, it's always directed towards large companies, right? I don't see anyone going to, the bodega on the corner and saying, hey, you need to take a position on who the president's going to be or on a particular political issue. Now, with that said, we focus on shareholders, but we have to remember that companies don't exist without revenues, and revenues they come from the customers of a business. And ultimately, the money and the resources that a CEO manages comes from the customers. And so fundamentally, any position that a company pays for, right, whether that's providing expanded benefits, pursuant to a particular political issue, that's coming from the customers. The customers are ultimately paying for that. And so my question is, and I actually want to mention another issue. We also talk about corporations as if they are entities unto themselves. Although they are entities unto themselves from a legal perspective, so that is on paper, practically, right, a company doesn't exist apart from the individuals that are agents of that corporation. And those individuals, of course, are members of the community. And so presumably, whenever they act, they are going to act in a way that is beneficial to them, and therefore the corporation is going to act in ways that are beneficial to the community. So my question is, should we even, segregate this issue, environmental, social governance, ESG, or should we just assume that it's implied in the nature of a business itself? So I guess, and I think you kind of addressed it slightly when you say that fundamentally a business, right, it's there to provide a product or service, and so to the extent that any issue impacts its ability to do that, then it's relevant. So I guess my question is, I think the reason why ESG has become an issue is because we're singling it out, even while we don't realize that it's actually embedded in what a business already does.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. I think I'm now going to offer a little more of a individual philosophy as opposed to what I've tried to do here, which is totally objective. But I have always believed that the way a corporation will return value to its investors is by catering to its customers and protecting its employees. So, and protecting its community and the environment. That's how I've always thought about business. So when the United Nations published that document, I thought, yeah, that sounds right. Because I think that's what companies do. And I think for 10 years, there was mostly, I think there was some activism, there was some energy around it. But gradually, I think participants, some, pushed the boundaries of that and started to push it in directions that were a little, this is my opinion, a little more self-serving and self-interested. There's an enormous service market in ESG. Accounting firms, accounting professors, accounting firms, law firms, consulting firms, non-governmental organizations, statistical rating agencies make billions of dollars, hundreds of billions. It's a huge industry. And I guess we have not seen reductions in the warming of the earth. I don't know if we've seen improved relations in gender or race. It perplexes me. I think when I look at the history, I'll go back to my somewhat objective view of this. I look at the history. This is a recurring swing. Capitalism is imperfect, and people get really mad, and they push on it, and then some of them will push too far, and you snap back. I see it in all four of those phases, and I see it now. So I think you're exactly right that a traditional conception of the corporation, I think the mechanism is designed to protect all constituents. Now that said, it's imperfect, and so sometimes it will skew unfairly, and maybe we do need pushback against that. And so sometimes, I mean, you see it all over the world. Human rights abuses of employees, slave labor, child labor. You see Nike in the 1990s, they're using slave labor. Nike, this iconic American company. So sometimes you need pressure, and it's desirable. But what I've seen in all of these episodes, and I think we're in the middle of it now, is that the movement attracts helpers and promoters who are really acting more in their self-interest than in the authentic aspects of the movement, and you get a pushback. And I think and just one other thing, and I'll let you go. Zealotry invites backlash. And I think one thing that has happened in each of these movements is it attracted zealots, and other participants, other people in society don't like that, and you get a backlash. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that now.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Cunningham. Thank you so much for the talk. It was great. Well, my name is Mizab. I work with the amazing Professors Rosenberg and Rocky as a Zicklin Fellow. Well, Rocky, I think, just left.
Hooray!
Yeah, so clearly I'm no CEO, but I am a student, and we students also have our opinions on hot topics such as abortion or the environment, or even like who's going to be the next president. So what would you recommend as a corporate director of our university to students? What framework would you recommend to us when we're dealing with the dilemma of speaking out or staying silent on political or academic issues?
Oh, well, I'll give you my opinion, but I'll first disclaim any expertise in that subject. I thank you so much, Rock. In our family, we teach respect, knowledge, persuasion, diplomacy, and we're inclined to intellectual engagement, study, debate, reasoning. I think that's what this university is all about, Baruch College and your center. And so I think leaning into these topics with those tools and that philosophy and that approach would be my favored approach. Now, I disclaimed any expertise because there are other people who think that's just not going to get you anywhere, and you need to take different approaches. But I'll leave it at that unless my wife has any other advice. Do you have any other advice, Stephanie?
Read the room. Use all of those tools that Professor Cunningham mentioned, but also, know your audience. I mean, that's really important. Read the room. Everyone doesn't need to know anything. Despite, that's not mainstream either. But they don't. If you're an accountant for your client. Your views don't necessarily matter. Same as a board member. Your duty is to them. So if you're talking among friends, among colleagues, it's different. If you're talking with clients, it's different.
I'm going to give the chalk to you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. Back to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation today. My question for you is regarding specific situations where you'll see a change in leadership that results in a change in culture. And from there, applying your framework, I'm wondering what you think regarding the timing of that and within announcing it to the public. So do you think that with a change in culture and through change in leadership, should there immediately be a change to the public eye, or do you think it should be more rolled out?
Thank you. It's a brilliant question. One of the most important jobs a board has is selecting the CEO and then supervising her or him and firing them if needed. And as a cognate, succession planning, having that name in the envelope, what we would do if this fellow drops dead tomorrow, or is incapacitated for whatever reason or just decides to retire. So, and I think as part of that succession planning process, the board thinks about what the leadership change will mean for the culture, for the norms and behaviors and expectations of all the constituents, starting with the employees and all the way out through the customers and the communities. And I think every board will be different, every company will be a little different, but I think unless the culture's degraded, one of the goals is to sustain it or at least facilitate a functional and responsible evolution and transition. And in thinking about that, things like this would be part of the discussion, right? That so right now our CEO is like the fellow that you worked, or the woman that you worked with, who just doesn't like to lean in, doesn't like to talk, doesn't want to be in the press, prefers to be low key. And this next person who we think would just be terrific at running this company is in the paper every day, just loves to be. So that's going to change, our dynamic in the boardroom. When we say, we think HR has this, and the new person's going to say, oh, no, I need to go out and make a speech about it. So you do need to think about that. And, again, part of my design is flexibility, context, principles, so that it should be feasible for that succession planning committee, that process, to say, well, if we appoint this person, we'll have to make some adjustments, and we'll have to sit down. It'll be one of the things we do when we review candidates, and especially if we get to the point of appointing someone. This is a topic we'll discuss. We'll talk also about products and innovation and human resources and shareholder relations, but we'll also talk about public exposure, public identification. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very smart. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'm almost tempted to ask, what would you do if you were in the board of directors of Tesla, and how you would handle somebody like Elon, but just in general.
But you're not going to ask that question?
I'm not going to ask that question, but I was just speaking. You can speak various ways. I mean, one way is by giving a certain amount of money. So how as a board do you see donations, PAC money, and should there be limits? And in certain corporations, they actually give significant amount of monies to both parties. And how does that come into the discussion?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is I would classify the question of corporate political lobbying or donations as a parallel topic to this. I think it's different. And it's different in a few ways. First of all, it's a much longer standing practice in this country. It goes back to Taft, I think, right? He was in the lobby of the Willard Hotel. That's what it's called. He used to sit there all day, and everyone would come and say, "Here, we should do more of this. We need more money in the farms." And so they call it lobbying ever since. So it's a long-standing practice and very highly regulated. So there are a lot of rules around donations and lobbying, and a lot of disclosures, and there are election laws that are around this. I mean, that's what Elon just got hit with a lawsuit yesterday, I think, for that contest where he's going to give cash to registered voters for some outcome, and there's a question about the legality of that. So there's a very elaborate legal framework and history and practice around that, whereas this area is new, 10 years old. So, I think companies will make decisions about how to spend their donations, where to lobby, whether to support both parties or more than one parties or down the ballot, according to their judgments about what's in the best interest of this company. And a lot of those decisions won't even get to the board. Those are largely managerial prerogatives, as long as they're obeying the law and that sort of thing. So it's parallel, but I think different. And thanks for not asking that question. And I won't give a direct answer, but I will I will say that the best boards of directors are those who have a spine that can stand up and tell a CEO, I don't support that. And in an egregious case, is saying, if you do, I'm going to resign publicly. And for public companies, it has to be public. If a director resigns from a public company, the company has to file with the SEC a statement that that's happening and give that person a chance to include her statement in it. And I did that once. And the most important skill a director has is business judgment. I mean, the most important requirement for that job, business judgment. And then exercising that will sometimes require, you know, I talked about collegiality and cooperation and all that, but sometimes the CEO needs to be told no. And so you got to design a recruiting process to get board members who will do that. And then you have to avoid disincentives for that. And so I like Warren Buffett's approach to the board of directors. He wants his board of directors, he has a lot of criteria, including business judgment and a shareholder focus. But one of them is that they should not need this job. They should not find it attractive for financial reasons. And, there are some boards where it's really attractive beyond the board because of a lot of money. And then you get bad, it's just, you're not going to have good corporate governance then. So, was that implicit enough, Stephanie? I didn't name names, did I? Yes, sir, Professor.
Yeah, thanks. You made reference earlier to products that align with someone's values. What do you mean by that? When I think about one's political values, you think that liberals drive Subarus, even though there's sort of nothing inherently liberal about a Subaru. So I think it must be marketing, right? Or are you talking more about something like, buying solar energy panels for your roof, which, even if that company isn't run in a particular way that aligns with your values, their product aligns with your values. What do you mean when you use that?
Yeah, it varies. And for a large run of companies, and probably all those smaller companies that one of the questioners asked about, there's no particular political identification with the entity, the product, the history, the founders, or anything like that. But there will be companies whose markets, for various reasons, congregate in a population with a shared sensibility. So Dick's Sporting Goods, right? It's the hunting and gun-loving community. Now, apparently Kamala Harris and her running mate both shoot guns, so maybe that's not a political thing. But historically, the Second Amendment advocates in the country tended to be Republican and tend to be conservative. And so if you're on that board, you have to be aware of that constituency. Or Harley-Davidson, which may not be political exactly, but there is a certain customer demographic. They tend to be older, tend to be like me, tend to have much longer hair. But there's a constituency, and you have to, as you're thinking about what you're going to talk about, you just have to be aware of who they are. And there's a list of companies, and again, it's not the dominant, Russell 3000, but there are particular companies that they were founded by people with a certain political or moral or religious orientation, and so that. And they might attract a certain constituency as a result of that, and just being sensitive to that base, I think is important. Or if you like, on the employee side, if your base is in a deeply red state, that's your headquarters, and then utterances that are blue may not be a good idea for that company, even if you feel very strongly about them. So I think prudence. A director should be paying attention to those factors. And if the CEO isn't getting that, coach her to make sure she understands. Oh, yes.
Hi, nice to meet you today. And my name is Lauren, and I am a sophomore student here at Baruch College, also part of the Baruch Accounting Society. As we touch base on to speak or not to speak, I have a question when I'm thinking, are are the CEO doing this on purpose for not to speak? Because as a statistic that I want to bring up, 20% of the people in the society are controlling the rest of 80% people. And also, do you agree on that statistic? And since the CEO not only performing its obligation to the stakeholder, but also to the community, do you think that there's a purpose that they do not face the question directly?
Yeah, there is an argument that silence is a position, and if that's true, then you may as well speak. But I think as a practical matter, some of that survey data indicated that there is a significant group of people who think staying silent is legitimate and is not an expression, it's not an endorsement or a rejection of a position. So I think a decision to stay silent should not automatically be taken as a positive or affirmative statement. I'll just give you an example. Again, I follow Berkshire Hathaway very closely. I know Warren Buffett very well. And he made the news 3 or 4 days ago. It was in response to a fake social media post on Facebook, I think, where an impersonator declared in his voice and countenance that he supported Kamala Harris. And he hadn't done that, and he wasn't planning on doing that. He wasn't planning on saying anything one way or the other, but because of that, he had to come out and say, I'm not supporting anybody. And that provoked enormous consternation. And I got a lot of phone calls and emails. What the hell is he up to? It was just like silence. It might just mean he's not endorsing anyone. and you might just have to accept that. And that he may have, for whatever reason. And I don't think we should require CEOs to have a position. And if they don't want to have a position, I don't think we should read anything into it, plus or minus. So I don't. I mean, I know. So I don't know about your statistic. Is 20% of what was the statistic?
I just want to touch base on the psychological effects. How if the argument are still growing and up, it will be beneficial to the economy.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll use Berkshire Hathaway again, Warren Buffett's company. It has Stephanie, how many shareholders? 1.2 million shareholders. They are from every walk of life, with every point of view. And if the idea that he's going to step out and say, I'm voting for Trump or voting for Harris, or I worry that that's not consistent with the company's best interests. Now, on the other hand, he's a unique person. He's a public figure. He owns 35% of the company, and so he might have a right or privilege to speak out as a shareholder or just as a public figure, and he has done that. He endorsed Obama twice and Hillary Clinton once. I think he endorsed Joe Biden too. Yeah, so he's 4 Democrats in a row. So in that one, I mean, you might even read. I think it's a lot of the people who were calling to complain to me were like, "Wow, what's going on there? This an implied repudiation of the Democratic candidate." I was like, I don't think so. But it's up to you. So I like what Stephanie said about knowing your audience or reading the room or recognizing that we don't have to articulate a public position on every topic, even if we have the megaphone. And I think Warren is right for whatever reason. And it might just because he's 96 and he feels like you all should decide. So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I think I enjoyed that conversation. Thank you all very, very much for those excellent questions and the kindness, the courtesy. Thank you all very much. Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Larry. Thank you, students, for your excellent questions. Thanks to the Accounting Society of Baruch for helping us with this event. And Thank you, Stephanie, also for your off-the-cuff remarks. We will invite you for your own talk next semester. We have a few more events coming up at the Zicklin Center this semester. There's about a month and a half left before finals. Our next event will be about sports washing. It'll be an online event with my colleague Mark Edelman from the law department, talking about the way countries use sports as a way of improving their images around the world. So look out for that. If you registered for this event, you're on our email list for life, so you will have probably already received an announcement about that. Thanks very much for coming.